Hi everyone, welcome to the Physionic podcast. If you're not familiar with who I am, my name is Nicholas Verhoeven. I'm currently pursuing my doctorate in molecular medicine. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that I was having a discussion with someone actually just last night and to figure out what I was going to be talking about on this week's podcast. And the topic came up of fiber. So I'm going to be talking about fiber because it is something that I've written a decent amount. I have also released some videos on this, so I've read numerous studies on it. But more specifically, I'd like to focus the conversation on bloating and fiber. So, and not only just kind of the mechanisms for how fiber leads to bloating, but also what you can potentially do to reduce the bloating that might occur if you are so inclined to consume fiber. So first off, what is fiber? Fiber, if you know of different macronutrients, you know of like fats, and you know of proteins, and you know of carbohydrates, and even alcohol has calories, so technically it's, I guess you could call it a macronutrient, but fiber falls in that nebulous area, kind of like alcohol, but it falls under the carbohydrate umbrella because of its chemical structure. So the chemical structure is relatively similar to that of like fructose and glucose. So it's kind of a hexagonal or pentagonal shape that's made up of carbon atoms. And when fiber is consumed, typically it's either doesn't provide almost any calories or it provides up to 2 calories per gram consumed. Now, the thing is that when people talk about fiber, they just talk about fiber as a general concept. So, you need to consume this amount of fiber, and I'll go into that in just a bit. But really, fiber comes in a whole lot of different varieties, and that's actually where we can find some of the solutions to some bloating issues that can occur when we either overconsume fiber, or even in situations where you underconsume fiber, or even when you're consuming the appropriate amount of fiber, you can still have issues with bloating. And again, I will explain why. So, but first, let me discuss the kind of traits of these different types of fibers. So, as I mentioned, there's the kind of umbrella term of fiber, but really fiber comes in soluble forms, insoluble forms, fermentable forms, non-fermentable, viscous and non-viscous. Those are kind of the big categories that I've been able to read up on over the years that I've done a little bit of reading here and there on fiber. So soluble is much like it sounds. It absorbs water and then it becomes kind of a gel-like situation where it will actually trap molecules, other food molecules and other molecules in general, like fats, for example, and will inhibit their ability to be absorbed. So it's a bit of a benefit because if you are consuming a high-fat diet and then you end up consuming fiber with that high-fat diet, that can mitigate some of that absorption of that fat. So you won't be taking up as many calories. That's just a small example, and a lot of the benefits that have been touted for fiber, like its anti-cancer effects, its anti-cardiovascular disease effects, those have been touted to be based off of I don't think people have really figured out the mechanism for why, mainly because fiber seems to have more of an impact than what was previously thought in terms of it doesn't just block these molecules from being absorbed, it also has an impact in our colon, in our large intestine. So the mechanisms are still a bit wishy-washy, but we do know that there's an association between, if I jump on cardiovascular disease, for example, we do know there's an association between higher fiber intake and lower cardiovascular disease risk. Now, I remember when I wrote this article on it, all of this stuff was based on associations. And to be frank, I didn't actually feel like fiber itself was leading to any significant effect. Although it does trap food molecules and therefore it inhibits those food molecules from being absorbed, therefore potentially lowering a person's weight, I just don't feel like in the overall diet of an individual that is going to have enough of an impact to actually affect cardiovascular disease. So what do I think is actually happening? Well, what I actually think is happening is that people that tend to eat a healthier diet, which tends to be lower calorie, also tend to be focused on consuming high fiber foods. So that's why I think that there's an association between fiber and lowering cardiovascular disease risk. Now, is that proof? No, I don't have any actual proof of that, and we certainly still need more research on the topic. But this podcast episode isn't so much focused on the positive benefits of fiber. Really, I'd like to focus on especially on the bloating aspect. But still, certainly know that there are benefits to fiber. And one of those benefits is actually based on its impact on our pooping ability. So our ability to pass our bowel movements. So you have this soluble fiber, and then you have insoluble fiber, which is highly related to this bowel movement and, well, our ability to poop. Then we've got fermentable fiber, which is actually a fiber that will be used by bacteria. And those bacteria will then allow us to produce what are known as short chain fatty acids. And presumably that's where we actually get the caloric content from fiber, because fiber doesn't usually get absorbed by the intestinal tract. It just goes through this fermentation process, which leads to the production of new molecules, and those molecules can then be used for energy. And then there's, of course, non-fermentable, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on, as well as viscous and non-viscous. So essentially, its ability in certain respects, how much it can actually trap within it, or really that's the context that a lot of fiber research that I've looked at has talked about it. But really the first four are the most talked about genres of fibers: so soluble, insoluble, fermentable, and non-fermentable. So how much should a person consume? Well, women typically are prescribed around like 25 grams per day, and men are around 38 grams just because they're larger individuals. But really more specific recommendations from what I remember from the article that I wrote, which again, for me to actually write that article, I have to read many different studies. So I've certainly looked through the literature, and I trust my past self. So I believe they recommended something like 14 grams, 12 to 14 grams per 1,000 calories consumed. So if you know your diet generally, then you can just go off of that number, which will probably give you a more exact number. However, if you don't, then 25 for women and 38 for men is certainly will work perfectly fine. Okay, so now I really want to focus on this bloating aspect. So I did have to read quite a bit for this because I was curious on the potential mechanisms for why this actually occurs. So the bloating is presumably from a gas buildup, where you have a buildup of gas that's actually being released by a number of different factors. But the main factor is these bacteria. And I mentioned that fermentable fiber can be used by bacteria, and when they use this fermentable fiber and convert it to other molecules, what can happen is they end up producing different gases. So we're talking like CO2 and methane, and certainly others as well, but those are certainly the big two that most people recognize. So highly fermentable fibers do seem to cause stomach discomfort. There is an association between the two. And to speak more on this, this is going to be a bit strange, and I do not envy the researchers that had to do this, but I did read, I just briefly skimmed over a study, where they wanted to look up a lower fermentable fiber and see how that compared to a normal diet, so without fiber added. And the way they did this, and its overall effect on passing gas, so being able to poop and passing gas. And so they had these subjects, these participants. I think they had 8 people, and they were told to consume their typical diet, but then they either consume 30 grams of a partially fermentable fiber, or they didn't consume any fiber, and then they wanted to compare. But how did they exactly compare? Well, the researchers had to clean out the rectum so the ass of each of these subjects, each of these individuals, with about half a liter of water in an enema form, and for rectal evacuation, as they put it in the paper. And then they ended up sticking a catheter up the ass and up the rectum, and then they measured the amount of gas production in that region, because again, we're talking about the colon, so it's large intestine, which is the very last section of our body before we end up passing. So again, they used fiber or no fiber, and the fiber that they used is called psyllium. I believe that's how you pronounce it. If you know of a better pronunciation, please let me know. But I believe it's called psyllium, so Psyllium. And again, because this was a lower fermentable fiber, it ended up increasing stool weight, which is actually something that's corroborated in other papers as well, that certain fibers can increase stool weight, where the weight of the stool does play a factor when it comes to removing that stool, so actually passing that stool, so using the restroom. And it also increased the speed of passing. But what was special about this is that it produced very little gas, which is counterintuitive to what other studies have shown where they've used fermentable fibers. And in that situation, they have found that stomach discomfort did increase as a result of highly fermentable fibers. And that's why I really wanted to make that distinction earlier of the different types of dietary fiber. So what they found is that they had lower gas production, so you're going to get less bloating. They saw increased ability to evacuate stool, so be able to use the restroom, and also just the speed of passing, so the amount of time that you end up on the toilet reduces as well. So that is the type of fiber that you want to focus on when it comes to that kind of benefit, when it comes to actually using the restroom. And so I'm talking about low fermentable fiber. And probably as well, you'd probably want something like an insoluble fiber, although I'm not entirely sure about that, but for sure a low fermentable fiber. And you've got these different carbohydrates that people consume, complex carbohydrates like dietary wheats, oats, potatoes, and those actually increase the production of different gases, and that can actually lead to increased stomach discomfort as well. So it really depends on we're really focused on carbohydrates here. It very much depends on the type of carbohydrate that you're consuming. And is that carbohydrate going to end up in the large intestine? Because typically a carbohydrate will be broken down and absorbed in the small intestine. Therefore, it will have low impact on the actual gas production. However, if a complex carbohydrate or a fiber, dietary fiber, ends up in the colon, in the large intestine, that is where you find these colonies of these bacteria that specifically target those molecules and will convert them to energy-rich molecules, quote-unquote energy-rich. They only provide like 1.5 to 2 calories, something along those lines. So it's not incredibly energy-rich, but within that process, they're also producing gas. And if that ends up building up, that can be incredibly painful, of course. So there's really two factors to consider. It could be the speed of the fecal matter that's being released So if it's slower, then you're going to have more of a buildup in terms of just the actual space that's being filled in the large intestine. Then on top of that, if you're consuming fermentable fiber, then that massively increases the gas pressure. Therefore, you have two different factors that are increasing pressure, and therefore you're going to have a lot of stomach discomfort. So the takeaway, the big takeaway from this is to focus and try to find more non-fermentable, or at least low fermentable fibers, if that's what you want to consume for a fiber. Now, granted, on top of that, you want to make sure that you are trying to sample different types of fiber, because there are all kinds of different fibers out there. I'm just talking about psyllium because that's the one that they mentioned in this paper. But at least you would have, I mean, right here, I'm telling you that there's at least a pretty safe bet that with psyllium, then you'd have low stomach discomfort, at least based off of what these researchers ended up finding. And you can imagine you probably would not want to be a researcher on this particular study, or be the research assistants, the undergrads and masters and PhD students working on this work. I certainly don't envy them. So certainly focus on figure out the type of fiber, and they're not going to say that obviously on the actual nutrition label. It just says dietary fiber, or it just says fiber, and then it tells you the amount. So you're going to actually have to go on Google, and you're going to have to actually look and search for the different types of fiber that are out there. But the key word is try to type in, low fermentable fibers, and see what comes up with that. And then you should be able to get your fiber intake from that. As long as it also is able to help you in terms of packaging and building up your fecal matter, because that also has an impact. So you're not just trying to reduce your gas production, but you're also trying to increase the fecal production, the ability for fecal matter. I realize this sounds really weird, but fecal matter to actually clump together and to create weight. You want weight when it comes to your fecal matter. Come on, people. You want weight when it comes to your poop. How does everybody not know this by now? No. So I think it's pretty interesting, actually, to be honest with you. But that's the two takeaways to get from this: lowering your gas production from non-fermentable by reducing fermentable fibers, and then also focusing on fibers that will let you still use the restroom adequately and at a rapid pace. Okay, that's what I've got for you. I believe, yes, that's all I've got for you. And hopefully you find this informative. I realize that probably not a whole lot of people are talking about this, so I thought that this might be a good topic, and hopefully it'll help those that do suffer from stomach discomfort when it comes to consuming high fiber or even low fiber. If you massively overconsume fiber, you're just increasing that effect, right? So I guess I did have one more thing to say. I remember my roommate one time consumed like 80 grams of fiber in one sitting, and he didn't realize it till it was too late. Well, he had massive issues, massive gastrointestinal distress as a result, just a few hours to a few days later. It lasted for quite some time. So certainly you don't want to overconsume on your fiber either, but certainly, again, also underconsuming kind of affects the secondary output, the actual output from your ass of your fecal matter. Okay, that's where I'll leave it now. And with that said, I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful day, and I'll catch you in the next one. Have a good one. See ya.